This is Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid, Part 9. I explained it to Mrs. Heffley and she made Greg apologize, but I think he might have been being opposite. I'm sorry. Mrs. Heffley told us that sometimes friends get on each other's nerves, but we needed to figure things out since we had a whole day to go on our sleepover. She said maybe we should spend some time apart, and I thought that sounded like a great idea. So I hung out with Manny in his room for a while. Even though I was having fun with Manny, I missed my mom and dad, and I looked at their picture whenever I got the chance. The next time I saw Greg was when we had lunch. Mrs. Heffley made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and she even remembered to cut the crusts off mine. After we finished our sandwiches, she gave us chocolate chip cookies for dessert. She gave Greg one, but she gave me two because she said I was the guest, and guests are special. I ate one of my cookies, but I made a shield around the other cookie with my arms so Greg couldn't get it. Sometimes, if I have something Greg wants, he will lick it, so I won't want it anymore. That's exactly what he did last Halloween when I got more candy than he did. But Greg said he was full and didn't even want my cookie. He said that while I was playing with Manny, he was reading a book about magic, and he wanted to show me a trick. I really like magic, so I said okay. First, Greg told me to put my fingers on the edge of the table so they were close together, like this. Then Greg took my glass of milk and put it on top of my fingers. I asked him when the magic part was going to happen, and he said it was already happening because I couldn't move. Well, he was right, because if I did, the glass of milk would tip over and spill. And Mr. Heffley gets mad when I spill stuff in his house. But then Greg said, here's the real magic part, and he took my cookie and ate it up. After that, Greg went upstairs, but I was still stuck at the kitchen table, and I was still there a half hour later when Mrs. Heffley came back to the kitchen. I told her what Greg did, and boy was she mad, but it wasn't because of the magic trick. She was mad that Greg took something that belonged to me without asking. We went up to Greg's room, and then Mrs. Heffley told me I could pick out one of Greg's things to take home with me so we'd be even. Well, Greg had a bunch of cool toys that he never let me play with, so it was really hard to pick. But every time I got close to one of his favorites, he kind of let me know I shouldn't pick that one. I picked an action figure that was a knight with a missing arm, and Greg seemed okay with that. But as soon as Mrs. Heffley left the room, Greg said I could play with my lame action figure because he was going to play with all his cool stuff by himself. It kind of bugged me, and I wanted to bug Greg back. So I pretended I was having a total blast with my toy. Well, it worked, and Greg said I had to hand over his toy. I said, no way, and he said he was just going to wait for me to fall asleep and he'd take it back himself. I told him I was going to put the action figure down my underwear so he couldn't get it, and he didn't like that idea. Then Greg said he'd trade me for the action figure, and I asked him what he'd give me for it. Greg said he'd give me 99 cents for the night, and I said okay to that. But then Greg took a dirty sock out of his hamper and tried to get me to smell it. And I was like, what was that for? And Greg said that was my first scent. I said I wanted 99 cents, not 99 cents. But Greg said a deal's a deal, and then he tried to get me to smell another sock as my second scent. When I told Greg I was going to go tell on him again, he said he'd trade me his Lego dragon for my knight, and I said yes, because that dragon is way better than a knight with no arm. But then when I gave Greg my knight, he wouldn't give me the dragon because he said I should have remembered it was still opposite day. Well, that was the last straw for me, and I tried to grab the dragon from Greg, but it kind of slipped out of my hands and hit the floor and broke apart. I guess we were making a lot of noise because the next thing we knew, Greg's mom was back in the room. She said she was going to have to separate us for the rest of the night, which was fine with me. Mrs. Heffley said that we each had one half of the bedroom and that we had to stay on our own side. So she asked me which side I wanted, and I picked the side with the bed, which made Greg mad. When Mrs. Heffley went back to her room, Greg said he was turning on an invisible force field between our two sides. Then he said if someone crossed over, they'd get zapped. Greg said he was fine with me having the bed because he could sleep on an air mattress, and plus all the fun stuff was on his side of the room. And when I reached over to Greg's side for my action figure, sure enough, I got zapped. I opened the drawer in the table next to Greg's bed to see if he had any comics I could read. Well, there weren't any comics, but one of Greg's old handheld video games was in there. So I played it, and Greg couldn't do anything because of the force field. But Greg said I could play video games by myself like a nerd because he was having a wild party on his side of the room and I wasn't invited. And I got kind of jealous because his party looked pretty fun. I said, well, I'm having a party on my side, and it was even more wild than his party, and I had really good music. Greg said I couldn't even come up with an original idea, but I still think he was jealous of my party. Then Greg said the plug to my party speakers was on his side of the room, so he pulled it out to shut off my music. Greg got back to his party, and I tried to tell him to plug my speakers back in, but Greg couldn't hear me because the music at his party was too loud. But this time, Mr. Heffley came into the room, and Greg didn't notice him standing in the doorway. Mr. Heffley said he didn't want one more peep out of us, and then he left the room. We were both quiet for a long time, but then Greg tried to get me to laugh, and I almost did. I was kind of glad we had to be quiet because I was getting pretty sleepy anyway, and I wanted to go to bed. I told Greg I needed to brush my teeth, and he said too bad because the force field was still on, and I was trapped in my half of the room for the whole night. So I asked if he could just turn off the force field for a little while so I could brush my teeth, but he said once the force field is turned on, it stays on until the morning. And then Greg went to the bathroom to brush his teeth and came back to the room after he was done. Minty. That's when I remembered I need to use the bathroom before I go to bed every night so I don't have any accidents. But Greg said I was just going to have to hold it until the morning. I said I couldn't make it all the way to morning, and Greg said that wasn't his problem. I asked if Greg didn't shut off the force field, I was going to have to pee in the Chewbacca mug on the table next to Greg's bed. Then he told me he had a special invisible knife that could cut through the force field. Greg showed me how the knife worked by cutting a square in the force field right next to the table where the mug was. Then he reached through the hole and grabbed the mug. I asked Greg to cut a Rowley-sized hole in the force field so I could get through it to use the bathroom. But Greg said the knife ran on invisible batteries and they got used up when he made his hole, so I was out of luck. Then Greg started talking about all sorts of things that made me feel like I really needed to use the bathroom. Finally, Greg got tired and he fell asleep. I thought about trying to sneak past him, but I was worried he was just faking it and I was going to get zapped. After a while, I fell asleep too, but I woke up around 6 in the morning feeling like I was going to burst. I didn't care about the force field anymore, but I was worried that if I used the bathroom, I might wake up Mr. Heffley. But I should have just used the bathroom anyway because Mr. Heffley was already up for the day. Luckily, Mr. Heffley didn't look up in time to see me in the window, and when he got back to Greg's room, I was already back in bed. I fell back asleep after a while and got up when Mrs. Heffley said it was time for breakfast. After we ate, I went to get my night action figure from Greg's room, but I couldn't find the toy anywhere. Greg said he didn't know what happened to it, but Mrs. Heffley said he had to help me look for it. So the two of us searched Greg's room, but to be honest, he wasn't all that helpful. I guess Mrs. Heffley thought Greg was hiding the action figure from me because she said if he didn't hand it over in 2 minutes, then he was going to be in big trouble. Greg said he needed to use the bathroom, but he'd keep looking for my action figure after he was done. But I noticed he had something in his hand when he went in there. Greg locked the bathroom door, and Mrs. Heffley told him to come out right this instant. But then the toilet flushed, and when Greg opened the door, there wasn't anything in his hand anymore. Mrs. Heffley made Greg give me 3 toys, and this time I picked out ones that weren't broken. My mom and dad came and got me just before lunch, and boy, was I glad to see them. And P.S. If you wanted to know the answer to that knock-knock joke, it's elephants watch Elevision. And that's the end of part 9.